when three popular students decided to humiliate the quiet girl by lifting her skirt in front of the entire cafeteria. They had no idea she was a third-degree black belt who had spent years mastering combat techniques that would leave them unconscious. On the floor within seconds, Emma Nakamura had always been the type of student who disappeared into the background at Riverside High School. At 17, she possessed an understated presence that most people overlooked entirely. Her petite frame, standing barely 5 feet 2 inches tall, combined with her preference for oversized sweaters and long dark hair that she kept pulled back in a simple ponytail, created an impression of someone who wanted nothing more than to blend seamlessly into her surroundings. She spoke softly when spoken to, kept her head down while walking through the crowded hallways, and had perfected the art of making herself invisible in a school of over 2,000 students. What her classmates didn't know, what none of them could have possibly imagined, was that Emma had been training in martial arts since she was 4 years old. Her father, Hiroshi Nakamura, was a respected sensei who had immigrated from Japan 20 years earlier, bringing with him decades of experience in multiple fighting disciplines. He had established the Nakamura Dojo in their small California town, where he taught traditional karate, jujitsu, and aikido to a dedicated group of students who understood that martial arts was about far more than physical combat. Emma's training had been rigorous and uncompromising from the very beginning. While other children her age were playing with toys or watching cartoons, she was learning proper stance, breathing techniques, and the fundamental principles that would eventually transform her into a formidable fighter. Her father had insisted that she understand not just the physical aspects of martial arts, but the mental and spiritual components as well. Discipline, respect, humility, and self-control were drilled into her consciousness just as thoroughly as kicks, punches, and defensive maneuvers. By the time she entered high school, Emma had achieved her third-degree black belt, a rank that typically took most students 8 to 10 years to reach. She had competed in regional tournaments, winning gold medals in both forms and sparring divisions. Her speed and precision were remarkable, her technique flawless, and her ability to read opponents and anticipate their movements was something that impressed even veteran martial artists who had been training for decades. But Emma's father had taught her something else that was equally important: the responsibility that came with possessing such skills. True strength, he would tell her during their evening training sessions, is knowing when not to use your abilities. A martial artist who seeks conflict is no martial artist at all. We train not to hurt others, but to protect ourselves and those who cannot protect themselves. These words had shaped Emma's entire approach to life, leading her to adopt a philosophy of non-confrontation that her classmates interpreted as weakness or timidity. At Riverside High, Emma had successfully maintained her low profile for the first 3 years of her education. She earned excellent grades without drawing attention to herself, completed her assignments diligently, and avoided the social dynamics that seemed to consume so many of her peers. She had a small circle of friends who appreciated her quiet intelligence and dry sense of humor, but she had never been part of the popular crowd, nor had she ever wanted to be. The social hierarchy at Riverside High was clearly defined and ruthlessly enforced. At the top of the pyramid sat students like Madison Phillips, whose father owned the largest construction company in town, and whose mother served on the school board. Madison was everything that Emma was not: tall, blonde, outgoing, and possessed of the kind of confidence that came from never having been told no. She moved through the school like she owned it, surrounded by a carefully curated group of followers who hung on her every word and laughed at her jokes whether they were funny or not. Alongside Madison and the popular elite were students like Trevor Morrison, the star quarterback whose athletic achievements had already earned him scholarship offers from several major universities, and Ashley Chen, whose family's wealth and social connections had guaranteed her a place among the school's aristocracy despite her relatively recent arrival in town. These students lived in a world of privilege and entitlement, where their desires were rarely questioned and their actions seldom carried consequences. Emma had always been careful to stay off their radar, understanding instinctively that drawing their attention would likely result in the kind of social persecution that could make her remaining time at Riverside High unbearable. She had watched from a distance as other students who had somehow offended or annoyed the popular crowd found themselves subjected to campaigns of harassment, exclusion, and humiliation that could last for months or even years. The unwritten rules of Riverside High were simple. Stay in your lane, don't challenge the established order, and never, ever make the mistake of thinking you were equal to those who had been deemed your social superiors. Emma had followed these rules faithfully, believing that her quiet compliance would ensure that she could complete her education without incident and move on to college, where she hoped to find a more accepting environment. She had no way of knowing that her very invisibility, her determined effort to avoid conflict, had been noticed by Madison and her circle. To them, Emma represented something that they found deeply irritating, someone who seemed immune to their influence, who didn't appear to care about their approval or disapproval. Her indifference to the social games that dominated high school life was interpreted as arrogance, her quiet confidence mistaken for superiority. Madison had spent weeks observing Emma, looking for weaknesses or vulnerabilities that could be exploited. She noticed how Emma always sat alone during lunch, how she never participated in school events or activities, how she seemed to drift through her days without forming meaningful connections with anyone outside her small group of equally invisible friends. To Madison, Emma's isolation wasn't a choice but a character flaw, evidence of her inability to function in normal social situations. The decision to target Emma hadn't been made impulsively. Madison and her friends had discussed it extensively, planning their approach with the kind of careful consideration that they usually reserved for organizing parties or coordinating outfits. They had observed Emma's routines, identified her most vulnerable moments, and developed a strategy that they believed would break through her protective shell and expose whatever insecurities lay beneath her calm exterior. They had no understanding of what they were actually dealing with. Emma's quietness wasn't the result of fear or social anxiety, but rather the product of years of training that had taught her to observe before acting, to think before speaking, and to maintain control over her emotions even in stressful situations. Her apparent vulnerability was actually a form of camouflage, hiding capabilities that would have shocked anyone who had bothered to look. Beyond surface appearances, Emma's daily routine at Riverside High had become as predictable as clockwork. She arrived at school precisely 15 minutes before the first bell, giving herself enough time to organize her materials and mentally prepare for the day ahead. She moved through her classes with quiet efficiency, taking detailed notes, participating when called upon, but never volunteering information or drawing unnecessary attention to herself. During lunch periods, she typically found a spot at one of the smaller tables near the windows where she could eat her homemade meal while reading or reviewing her notes for afternoon classes. She had learned to tune out the constant chatter and social drama that swirled around her, creating a bubble of calm in the midst of the cafeteria's chaos. After school, while most students rushed to their cars or gathered in groups to socialize, Emma would make her way to the library, where she would spend an hour or two working on homework or research projects. Only then would she head home, where she would change into her training clothes and spend the evening at her father's dojo, practicing the techniques that had become as natural to her as breathing. This carefully structured routine had served her well throughout her high school career, allowing her to maintain her academic performance while avoiding the interpersonal conflicts that seemed to plague so many of her classmates. She had convinced herself that she could continue this pattern for the remaining months of her senior year, graduate with honors, and leave Riverside High behind forever without ever having to reveal the warrior that existed beneath her peaceful Exterior. But Madison Phillips and her circle of friends had other plans, and Emma's world was about to change in ways that she could never have anticipated. The skills that her father had spent years teaching her, the discipline and training that had shaped every aspect of her character, were about to be put to a test that would challenge everything she believed about herself and the principles that had guided her life. The quiet girl who had spent 3.5 years avoiding conflict was about to discover that sometimes, despite your best efforts to remain invisible, conflict finds you anyway. And when it did, Emma Nakamura would prove that appearances could be devastatingly deceptive. Emma's typical morning at Riverside High began the same way it had for the past 3 years. She parked her modest Honda Civic in the student lot, carefully avoiding the premium spots near the main entrance that were unofficially reserved for the popular students and their expensive vehicles. Her backpack, worn but well-maintained, contained the same meticulously organized supplies that had carried her through countless academic challenges: color-coded notebooks, mechanical pencils arranged by lead thickness, and a planner where every assignment and deadline was recorded in her precise handwriting. The hallways of Riverside High buzzed with the familiar energy of morning social rituals. Students clustered around lockers, sharing weekend stories and gossip, while others hurried past with the focused determination of those running late for first period. Emma navigated these corridors with practiced efficiency, her route calculated to avoid the most congested areas where popular students typically congregated. She had mapped out alternative pathways years ago, learning to use less traveled staircases and side corridors that allowed her to move between classes without drawing attention. Her first period, a P literature class, represented everything Emma loved about academic life. Mrs. Rodriguez, a passionate educator in her 50s, had created an environment where intellectual curiosity was valued above social status. Emma thrived in these discussions about symbolism in classical novels and the cultural context of poetry, contributing thoughtful insights when called upon while maintaining her preference for listening rather than dominating conversations. Her essays consistently earned the highest marks in the class, though she never mentioned these achievements to anyone outside her small circle of friends. During the brief transition between classes, Emma observed the intricate social ecosystem that surrounded her daily. She watched Madison Phillips hold court near the trophy cases, surrounded by admirers who laughed at predetermined intervals and nodded enthusiastically at everything she said. Trevor Morrison commanded attention near the gym entrance, his leather jacket serving as a visual reminder of his athletic accomplishments and social status. Ashley Chen coordinated plans for weekend activities with the casual authority of someone accustomed to having others accommodate her preferences. Emma had developed an almost anthropological fascination with these social dynamics over the years. She could predict with remarkable accuracy which students would be included in various activities, whose relationships would flourish or falter, and how information would travel through the school's informal communication networks. This observational skill, honed through years of remaining on the periphery, had taught her to read people in situations with the same precision she applied to her martial arts training. Her second period, advanced placement chemistry class, presented different challenges, requiring the kind of analytical thinking that Emma had always found naturally engaging. She worked methodically through complex equations and laboratory procedures, her movements deliberate and careful. Her lab partner, a quiet boy named James who shared her preference for academic focus over social interaction, appreciated her thorough preparation and attention to detail. Their partnership had developed into one of mutual respect and efficient collaboration, though their conversations rarely extended beyond the requirements of their assignments. The transition to third period brought Emma into contact with a broader cross-section of the student body. Her AP history class included several students from different social circles, creating an environment where the usual hierarchies were somewhat less rigid. Emma particularly enjoyed the analytical discussions about historical patterns and their contemporary relevance, finding that her teacher, Mr. Patel, encouraged critical thinking and multiple perspectives on complex issues. During these class discussions, Emma occasionally caught glimpses of the person she might have been in a different environment. When debating the factors that led to social revolutions or analyzing the role of individual actions in historical change, she found herself speaking with more confidence and passion. These moments reminded her that her quietness was a choice rather than a limitation, a strategy for navigating her current circumstances rather than a fundamental aspect of her personality. Fourth period brought her greatest challenge: physical education. The one class where her carefully maintained low profile became most difficult to sustain. Coach Williams ran a traditional program that emphasized competitive sports and team activities, creating situations where Emma's athletic abilities sometimes threatened to surface despite her efforts to appear average. She had developed strategies for moderating her performance, deliberately missing shots she could easily make and avoiding displays of the speed and agility that years of martial arts training had developed. The irony wasn't lost on Emma that she spent her pay classes pretending to be less capable than she actually was, while her classmates often exaggerated their abilities or made excuses for poor performance. She watched students struggle with basic flexibility exercises that would have been trivial for someone with her training, observed others fail at coordination drills that she could complete blindfolded, and listened to complaints about physical challenges that she would have considered gentle warm-up activities. Her lunch period had evolved into a carefully orchestrated routine, designed to minimize social friction while maximizing her ability to recharge for afternoon classes. The cafeteria, with its complex seating arrangements that reflected and reinforced social hierarchies, required strategic navigation. Emma had identified a small table near the windows where she could eat her homemade meals, while observing the social dynamics around her without becoming entangled in them. Her lunch typically consisted of foods that reflected her family's Japanese heritage: rice balls filled with various ingredients, miso soup in a thermos, and fresh vegetables prepared with traditional seasonings. These meals, lovingly prepared by her mother each morning, provided both nutritional fuel and a comforting connection to her cultural identity. She ate slowly and mindfully, a practice that her father had taught her as part of developing the mental discipline that was essential to martial arts training. From her vantage point near the windows, Emma could observe the entire cafeteria ecosystem. She watched the popular students' table, where Madison Phillips orchestrated conversations with the skill of an experienced conductor directing an orchestra. Every topic of discussion seemed to revolve around parties, social media drama, or plans for activities that reinforced their group's exclusive status. The athletes' table, dominated by Trevor Morrison and his teammates, focused on sports statistics, weekend games, and the kind of competitive banter that served to establish and maintain their pecking order. Other tables reflected different aspects of the school's social structure: the theater students who gestured dramatically while discussing their latest production, the academic achievers who compared study strategies and college application timelines, the art students who sketched while they ate, and the various smaller groups that had formed around shared interests or circumstances. Emma appreciated this diversity, even though she remained deliberately disconnected from most of it. Her afternoon classes, AP Calculus, Advanced Biology, and Study Hall, represented the academic core of her high school experience. These courses challenged her intellectually and provided the kind of rigorous preparation that would serve her well in college. Emma approached each subject with the same methodical discipline that characterized her martial arts training: breaking complex problems into manageable components and working through them systematically. In AP Calculus, she found satisfaction in the logical progression of mathematical concepts and the elegant solutions that emerged from careful analysis. Her teacher, Mr. Thompson, had quickly recognized her capabilities and occasionally presented her with additional challenges that pushed her understanding to deeper levels. Emma appreciated these opportunities to extend her learning, though she was careful not to appear too eager or to outshine her classmates in ways that might draw unwanted attention. Advanced biology combined her interest in scientific analysis with hands-on laboratory work that required precision and attention to detail. Emma excelled at microscopy and specimen preparation, skills that translated surprisingly well from the fine motor control required in martial arts. Her lab reports were consistently among the most thorough and well-researched in the class, earning praise from Mrs. Garcia. While maintaining her preference for quiet achievement over public recognition, study hall provided an opportunity for Emma to work on assignments, review notes, and prepare for upcoming tests and projects. She used this time efficiently, organizing her materials and planning her approach to various academic challenges. The supervised study environment also allowed her to observe her classmates' work habits and study strategies, information that helped her understand their strengths and weaknesses without having to engage in direct academic competition. After school, Emma typically spent time in the library, taking advantage of its quiet atmosphere and extensive resources to work on research projects and long-term assignments. The library had become her sanctuary, a place where her love of learning could flourish without the social pressures that characterized most other areas of the school. Mrs. Patterson, the head librarian, had come to recognize Emma as one of her most reliable and responsible patrons, occasionally recommending books or research resources that might interest her. The drive home from school provided Emma with transition time between her academic life and her training routine. She used these 20 minutes to decompress from the day's social navigation, while mentally preparing for the evening's martial arts practice. Her father's dojo was located in a converted warehouse on the outskirts of town, far enough from the main commercial district to maintain the quiet atmosphere that serious training required. The Nakamura dojo represented everything that was missing. From Emma's school experience, respect for tradition, emphasis on personal growth, and a community built around shared values rather than social status. Her father had created an environment where students were judged solely on their dedication, effort, and progress rather than their economic background or family connections. Emma treasured these evening hours when she could be completely authentic, expressing herself through physical movement and martial discipline without concern for social consequences. Her training routine typically began with meditation and stretching, activities that helped her transition from the mental energy required for academic work to the physical and spiritual focus necessary for martial arts practice. These preparatory exercises also served to release any tension or frustration that had accumulated during her school day, clearing her mind for the intensive training that would follow. Emma had no way of knowing that her carefully constructed routine was about to be shattered by events beyond her control, or that the skills she practiced each evening in the safety of her father's dojo would soon be needed in the hostile environment of Riverside High's social battlefield. Madison Phillips had ruled Riverside High's social landscape since her freshman year with the calculated precision of a military strategist. At 18, she possessed the kind of natural charisma that drew people into her orbit while simultaneously making them desperately afraid of being cast out. Her influence extended far beyond her immediate circle of friends, reaching into every corner of the school's complex social ecosystem. Teachers found themselves unconsciously favoring her in class discussions. Administrators overlooked minor infractions that would have resulted in consequences for other students, and even parents at school events seemed to gravitate toward her magnetic presence. Standing 5 feet 8 inches tall with perfectly styled platinum blonde hair and piercing blue eyes, Madison commanded attention wherever she went. Her wardrobe consisted entirely of designer pieces that she wore with the casual confidence of someone who had never questioned whether she belonged in any particular space. Each outfit was carefully selected to project the right combination of wealth, taste, and effortless superiority that maintained her position at the apex of the school's hierarchy. Her makeup was always flawless, applied with professional skill that made other girls feel inadequate by comparison, and her accessories were chosen to complement whatever message she wanted to send on any given day. Madison's family background had provided her with every advantage that money and social connections could offer. Her father, Richard Phillips, owned Phillips Construction, the largest building company in the county, with contracts that included everything from luxury residential developments to major commercial projects. Her mother, Catherine Phillips, served not only on the school board, but also chaired the hospital's fundraising committee and held prominent positions in several charitable organizations that provided her with extensive networks throughout the post-war community. The Phillips family lived in Riverside's most exclusive neighborhood, in a sprawling Mediterranean-style mansion that regularly appeared in local lifestyle magazines and served as the venue for the kind of social gatherings that determined who was considered important in their community. Madison had grown up attending these events, learning from an early age how to navigate complex social situations, read people's motivations, and leverage relationships to achieve her objectives. At Riverside High, Madison's inner circle consisted of carefully selected individuals who enhanced her status while posing no threat to her supremacy. Ashley Chen had earned her place through her family's recent acquisition of several profitable tech companies and their subsequent donation of a new computer lab to the school. Ashley's parents had immigrated from Taiwan with advanced degrees and entrepreneurial ambitions that had transformed into remarkable financial success within a single generation. Their wealth was newer than the Phillips family fortune, but substantial enough to warrant inclusion in Madison's exclusive group. Ashley possessed a sharp intelligence that Madison found useful for academic projects and strategic planning, combined with enough insecurity about her social position to ensure unwavering loyalty. At 17, Ashley had already mastered the art of appearing confident while constantly seeking approval from those she perceived as more socially powerful. Her wardrobe rivaled Madison's in expense, though she always managed to choose pieces that complemented rather than competed with whatever Madison wore on any given day. The third member of Madison's core group was Brianna Walsh, whose inclusion stemmed from her mother's position as the mayor's chief of staff and her father's ownership of the largest luxury car dealership in the region. Brianna brought political connections and access to information about community events and decisions that hadn't yet become public knowledge. She also possessed the kind of aggressive personality that made her an effective enforcer of Madison's will, willing to confront anyone who challenged their group's authority or questioned their decisions. Brianna's role in the group dynamics was particularly important because she served as the bridge between Madison's calculated leadership and the more direct forms of intimidation that were sometimes necessary to maintain their social dominance. While Madison preferred subtle manipulation and psychological pressure, Brianna had no qualms about using more obvious forms of harassment when situations required immediate action. Her athletic build and naturally confrontational personality made her an ideal instrument for dealing with problems that couldn't be resolved through social maneuvering alone. The fourth core member was Jessica Torres, whose family owned several successful restaurants throughout the county and whose connections in the food service industry proved valuable for organizing events and securing venues for parties. Jessica's role was primarily logistical, handling the practical details that allowed Madison to focus on the broader strategic aspects of maintaining their social position. She possessed an almost supernatural ability to coordinate complex social events, manage competing personalities, and resolve conflicts before they threatened the group's cohesion. Together, these four young women had created a power structure that influenced virtually every aspect of social life at Riverside High. Their approval could elevate unknown students to positions of prominence, while their disapproval could result in social exile that lasted for years. They controlled access to the most desirable parties, determined which students would be included in various activities, and established the unwritten rules that governed acceptable behavior throughout the school. Madison's method of maintaining control relied heavily on her ability to identify and exploit the insecurities of those around her. She had developed an almost supernatural talent for recognizing exactly what each person wanted most desperately and then positioning herself as either the path to achieving those desires or the obstacle preventing their fulfillment. Students who sought popularity found themselves competing for her attention and approval, while those who valued academic recognition discovered that Madison's influence extended into classroom dynamics and teacher perceptions. The system that Madison had constructed was both elegant and ruthless in its efficiency. Rather than relying solely on obvious displays of power, she had created an environment where students policed themselves, afraid to step out of line for fear of social consequences that could affect every aspect of their high school experience. Teachers and administrators, whether consciously or unconsciously, had become part of this system, responding to social cues and established hierarchies in ways that reinforced Madison's authority. Emma Nakamura represented something that Madison found deeply troubling, a student who seemed genuinely indifferent to the social structure that Madison had worked so hard to create and maintain. While other students either sought Madison's approval or actively feared her disapproval, Emma appeared to exist in a completely separate reality where Madison's influence simply didn't matter. This indifference challenged the fundamental assumption upon which Madison's power was based, that everyone at Riverside High cared about their position in the social hierarchy. Madison had initially tried to ignore Emma's existence, assuming that her invisibility was simply another form of social positioning that could be understood and managed within the existing framework. But as weeks turned into months, Madison began to realize that Emma's behavior wasn't strategic in any conventional sense. She wasn't trying to fly under the radar to avoid conflict, nor was she positioning herself for some future social advancement. Emma genuinely seemed to have no interest in the games that consumed everyone else's attention. This realization was profoundly disturbing to Madison because it suggested that her carefully constructed system of social control had limitations that she hadn't previously recognized. If one student could simply opt out of the hierarchy without consequences, what prevented others from following the same path? The very existence of Emma's alternative approach threatened to expose the artificial nature of the social rules that Madison had spent years establishing and enforcing. Madison's initial response was to conduct careful observations of Emma's daily routine, looking for vulnerabilities or pressure points that could be exploited to bring her into the established system. She studied Emma's interactions with teachers, her academic performance, her friendship patterns, and her family background, searching for information that could be used to understand and ultimately control her behavior. These investigations revealed a frustrating lack of the usual weaknesses that Madison had learned to identify and manipulate in other students. Emma's academic performance was consistently excellent, but she didn't seem to care about recognition or competitive rankings that motivated other high-achieving students. Her friendships appeared genuine and stable, but were limited to a small group of equally invisible students who showed no interest in expanding their social circles or gaining broader acceptance. Her family background seemed solid and supportive, providing no obvious sources of insecurity or desperation that could be leveraged for social manipulation. Perhaps most frustrating of all, Emma seemed genuinely content with her position outside the established social structure. She showed no signs of longing for inclusion in popular activities, no jealousy toward students who received more attention, and no apparent awareness that she was missing out on experiences that other students considered essential to high school life. Her satisfaction with her current circumstances made traditional forms of social pressure completely ineffective. As Madison's frustration grew, she began to interpret Emma's indifference as a form of arrogance that demanded correction. In Madison's worldview, anyone who refused to acknowledge her authority was essentially claiming to be superior to the system that she represented. Emma's quiet confidence and apparent self-sufficiency were reframed as evidence of an attitude problem that needed to be addressed through more direct intervention. The decision to target Emma for active harassment wasn't made impulsively, but rather emerged from weeks of careful consideration and strategic planning. Madison had concluded that Emma's continued existence outside the established social order represented a threat that could no longer be ignored. If other students began to notice that it was possible to simply ignore the rules that governed social interaction at Riverside High, the entire system that Madison had worked to create could begin to unravel. Madison's plan required careful coordination with her inner circle, each of whom brought different skills and perspectives to the challenge of breaking through Emma's protective shell. Ashley's analytical abilities were useful for identifying potential weak points in Emma's psychological defenses, while Brianna's aggressive personality would be essential for the more direct forms of confrontation that might be necessary. Jessica's logistical expertise would ensure that their campaign against Emma was coordinated and sustained rather than consisting of random, isolated incidents. The strategy that emerged from their planning sessions was designed to escalate gradually, beginning with subtle forms of social pressure and building toward more direct confrontations if Emma continued to resist integration into the established hierarchy. Madison believed that everyone had a breaking point, and that Emma's apparent invulnerability was simply a facade that would crumble under sufficient pressure. What Madison and her circle failed to understand was that Emma's quiet confidence wasn't based on social positioning or psychological defense mechanisms, but rather on genuine capabilities that they couldn't even imagine. The skills that Emma had developed through years of martial arts training had created a foundation of self-assurance that existed independently of social approval or acceptance. Her indifference to their authority wasn't arrogance or rebellion, but rather the natural result of possessing inner resources that made their approval irrelevant to her sense of self-worth. The stage was now set for a confrontation between two completely different approaches to power and influence. Madison's carefully constructed social authority based on manipulation and control versus Emma's quiet strength rooted in discipline, training, and genuine self-confidence. Neither side fully understood what they were facing, but the collision between these opposing forces would soon reshape the entire social landscape of Riverside High in ways that none of them could have anticipated. The campaign against Emma began subtly, with incidents so minor that they could easily be dismissed as coincidence or misunderstanding. Madison's strategy was deliberate in its gradual escalation, designed to test Emma's responses while maintaining plausible deniability if questioned by teachers or administrators. The first phase involved what appeared to be accidental encounters in the hallways, where Emma would find herself bumped into or jostled, just enough to disrupt her careful navigation between classes. These initial contacts were executed with surgical precision, timed to occur during the busiest transition periods, when the hallways were most crowded and chaotic. Ashley would accidentally shoulder check Emma while appearing to be engaged in animated conversation with Brianna, causing Emma's carefully organized books and materials to scatter across the floor. The collision would be followed by perfunctory apologies that sounded sincere to any adults who might be observing, but carried undertones of mockery that Emma recognized immediately. Emma's response to these early provocations was exactly what her father's training had taught her: calm assessment of the situation, controlled emotional reactions, and strategic non-engagement. She would quietly gather her scattered materials, accept the false apologies with polite acknowledgement, and continue to her destination without giving any indication that she understood the deliberate nature of these encounters. Her composed reactions frustrated Madison's group, who had expected signs of distress or anger that would justify escalating their harassment. The second phase introduced more obvious forms of social exclusion and public embarrassment. During group projects in various classes, Emma would find herself mysteriously left without partners, forcing teachers to either assign her to existing groups where she was clearly unwanted or allow her to work alone while everyone else collaborated. When she tried to sit at tables during lunch, other students would suddenly remember urgent reasons to move elsewhere, leaving her isolated in ways that appeared natural but were actually orchestrated through Madison's extensive network of influence. Emma's locker became a target for increasingly bold acts of vandalism and interference. She would arrive at school to find her combination lock turned just enough to make opening it difficult and time-consuming, causing her to be late for the first period despite her habitually early arrival. Papers and assignments that she was certain she had secured would disappear, only to be found later in unexpected locations with subtle damage that required her to redo work that she had already completed. Her textbooks would be rearranged or hidden, forcing her to spend valuable time searching for materials that should have been readily accessible. The psychological pressure of these constant minor disruptions was designed to wear down Emma's resistance through accumulated stress and frustration. Madison understood that most students would eventually crack under this kind of sustained low-level harassment, either by lashing out in ways that would get them in trouble with school authorities, or by surrendering and seeking accommodation. Within the existing social structure, Emma's continued composure in the face of these provocations only strengthened Madison's conviction that more direct action would be necessary. During PE classes, the harassment took on physical dimensions that tested the boundaries of what could be dismissed as normal competitive activity. Emma found herself consistently targeted during team sports, with opponents who seemed unusually aggressive in their attempts to block, tackle, or otherwise physically dominate her. Basketball games became exercises in controlled violence where Emma was repeatedly fouled in ways that appeared accidental, but were clearly intentional to anyone paying close attention. Coach Williams, like most adults in the school, seemed oblivious to the systematic nature of what was happening to Emma. When she reported obvious fouls or dangerous plays, she was told that physical contact was a normal part of competitive sports, and that she needed to develop thicker skin if she wanted to participate successfully. The coach's dismissive attitude emboldened Madison's allies to become even more aggressive, knowing that their actions would be interpreted as normal athletic competition rather than targeted harassment. Emma's carefully developed strategies for moderating her physical performance became increasingly difficult to maintain as the attacks against her intensified. Her martial arts training included extensive conditioning and defensive techniques that made her naturally resistant to the kinds of physical intimidation that would have been effective against most other students. She found herself constantly calculating how much of her actual capabilities she could reveal without exposing the extent of her training and potentially escalating the conflict to dangerous levels. The third phase of Madison's campaign moved into academic sabotage, targeting the area where Emma had always found the most satisfaction and success. Group presentations became opportunities for systematic undermining, where Emma's carefully researched contributions would be dismissed or ignored by teammates who had been recruited into Madison's expanding network of influence. Her ideas would be stolen and presented by others without credit, while her actual contributions would be minimized or criticized as inadequate. Teachers began receiving anonymous complaints about Emma's work habits and group dynamics, suggesting that she was difficult to work with and uncooperative in collaborative settings. These reports were carefully crafted to sound like legitimate concerns from multiple students, creating a false narrative that Emma was a problem student who disrupted classroom harmony. The cumulative effect of these complaints began to influence teacher perceptions, leading to subtle changes in how Emma's contributions were received and evaluated. Laboratory partners in science. classes started making mistakes that would ruin Emma's experiments or contaminate her samples, forcing her to start over with insufficient time to complete assignments properly. Her meticulous preparation and organizational skills helped her adapt to some of these sabotage attempts, but the constant need to anticipate and counter deliberate interference added significant stress to her academic routine. The most insidious aspect of this academic harassment was how it exploited the trust and collaboration that were supposed to be fundamental values in educational settings. Emma had always believed that school was a sanctuary where intellectual curiosity and academic achievement were valued above social politics. But Madison's campaign demonstrated that even these supposedly neutral spaces could be weaponized for social control. Emma's small circle of friends began to feel the pressure as well, as Madison's influence network made it clear that association with Emma would carry social costs. Students who had previously been friendly began to distance themselves, afraid that defending Emma or maintaining their friendships would make them targets for similar treatment. The isolation tactics were particularly effective because they didn't require direct threats or obvious intimidation, instead relying on the implied understanding that crossing Madison's group would result in social exile. James, Emma's chemistry lab partner, found himself facing increasing pressure to request a partner change, with suggestions that his association with Emma was holding back his own academic and social progress. The quiet boy who had appreciated Emma's competence and reliability began to show signs of stress and uncertainty, torn between loyalty to a good friend and fear of the consequences that continued association might bring. Emma recognized his dilemma and eventually suggested that he would be better served by working with other students, releasing him from any obligation to defend her against the increasing hostility. The fourth phase introduced direct verbal harassment that was carefully calibrated to occur in situations where adult supervision was minimal or ineffective. Madison and her group would position themselves near Emma during transitions between classes, making comments that were just loud enough for Emma to hear but quiet enough to avoid attracting attention from teachers or administrators. These verbal attacks focused on Emma's appearance, her social isolation, her family background, and her perceived arrogance in refusing to acknowledge the established social order. "Look, it's the ghost girl again," Brianna would whisper as Emma passed, her voice carrying just enough volume to ensure that nearby students could hear and understand that Emma was being targeted. "Does she think she's better than everyone else because she doesn't talk to anyone?" Ashley would add, following up with speculation about Emma's family situation and whether her parents knew how weird and antisocial their daughter had become. These verbal assaults were designed to accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously. They reinforced Emma's isolation by making other students afraid to associate with her. They established Madison's group as the arbiters of social acceptability, and they tested Emma's self-control to see if they could provoke reactions that would justify more severe retaliation. The comments were crafted to exploit common teenage insecurities about appearance, belonging, and social acceptance, areas where most students were particularly vulnerable to psychological manipulation. Emma's training in mental discipline proved invaluable during these verbal attacks, allowing her to maintain her composure while accurately assessing the strategic intent behind each provocation. She recognized that responding emotionally would only escalate the situation and provide Madison's group with ammunition for future attacks. Her continued calm in the face of increasingly personal insults frustrated harassers and convinced them that more dramatic action would be necessary to achieve their objectives. The harassment began to follow Emma beyond school grounds, extending into community spaces where she had previously felt safe from the toxic dynamics of high school. Social politics. Madison's group would appear at the grocery store where Emma shopped with her mother, making loud comments about weird families and antisocial kids that were clearly intended to embarrass Emma in front of her family. They would show up at the library where Emma often went to study, creating disturbances that made concentration difficult and forced her to find alternative locations for academic work. Social media became another front in the campaign against Emma. With carefully crafted posts that didn't mention her by name, but included enough identifying details to make their target obvious to anyone from Riverside High. Photos, taken without Emma's knowledge or consent, would be posted with captions questioning her mental health, her social skills, and her family background. These posts were designed to create a permanent digital record of Emma's supposed inadequacies, ensuring that the harassment would follow her beyond graduation and potentially impact her future college and career prospects. The escalation reached a turning point when Madison's group began to recruit younger students and members of other social circles into their campaign against Emma. Freshmen and sophomores who desperately wanted acceptance from the popular crowd were given opportunities to prove their loyalty by participating in the harassment, spreading rumors, or contributing to the general atmosphere of hostility that surrounded Emma's daily existence. This expansion of the persecution network made it virtually impossible for Emma to find safe spaces within the school environment. By the spring semester of her senior year, Emma's situation had deteriorated to the point where every aspect of her school experience was tainted by the systematic campaign against her. The halls that she had once navigated with quiet confidence had become gauntlets of whispered insults and orchestrated humiliation. The classrooms where she had found intellectual stimulation were now sources of stress and anxiety, as she constantly anticipated the next act of sabotage or exclusion. The cumulative effect of months of harassment was beginning to test even Emma's carefully developed self-control and emotional discipline. Her father noticed changes in her behavior at home, subtle signs of stress and fatigue that suggested his daughter was facing challenges that she hadn't shared with him. Her mother observed that Emma's usual enthusiasm for learning had been replaced by a grim determination to simply survive until graduation, when she could escape to a college environment where her past would be irrelevant. The stage was now set for the final, most dramatic escalation of Madison's campaign against Emma, an act of public humiliation that would force Emma to make a choice between continuing to endure in silence and revealing capabilities that would change everything about how she was perceived at Riverside High. Neither Madison nor Emma fully understood what was about to unfold, but the collision course that had been building for months was about to reach its inevitable conclusion. The incident that would change everything began on a seemingly ordinary Tuesday afternoon in late April. Emma had developed a routine of eating lunch in the school's courtyard when weather permitted, finding the outdoor environment less claustrophobic than the cafeteria's charged social atmosphere. The courtyard, with its scattered picnic tables and mature oak trees, typically provided a peaceful refuge where she could enjoy her homemade meal while reviewing notes for afternoon classes or simply observing the natural world that existed beyond the artificial boundaries of high school social politics. On this particular day, Emma had chosen a table positioned near the courtyard's eastern edge, partially shaded by an overhanging branch that created a natural canopy above her usual spot. She had spread her materials across the weathered wooden surface, her chemistry textbook open to a chapter on molecular bonding, a notebook filled with her precise handwriting, and the ceramic container that held her mother's carefully prepared lunch. The spring air carried the scent of blooming jasmine from the school's landscaped borders, and Emma had allowed herself a rare moment of genuine relaxation as she worked through complex chemical equations. The tranquil atmosphere was shattered when Madison Phillips approached with her entire entourage in tow, their coordinated movement suggesting a predetermined plan rather than a casual encounter. Emma's peripheral vision caught their approach while she was absorbed in her studies, but years of martial arts training had taught her to remain aware of her surroundings, even when focused on other tasks. She didn't look up immediately, hoping that the group would pass by without incident, but their purposeful trajectory made it clear that she was their intended destination. "Well, look what we have here," Madison announced, her voice carrying the theatrical quality that she employed when performing for an audience. "It's our favorite little hermit, having lunch all by herself again." The statement was loud enough to attract attention from other students scattered throughout the courtyard, effectively turning Emma's private moment into a public spectacle. Emma continued eating methodically, maintaining the calm demeanor that had served her well throughout months of escalating harassment. Ashley Chen positioned herself directly across from Emma's table, while Brianna Walsh and Jessica Torres flanked Madison on either side, creating a semicircle that blocked Emma's most direct escape routes. The formation was strategic, designed to trap Emma in place while ensuring that any attempt to leave would require her to push past one of her tormentors, potentially escalating the confrontation in ways that could be used to justify retaliation. "You know what I find really interesting about you," Madison continued, settling onto the bench across from Emma with the casual confidence of someone claiming territory that rightfully belonged to her. "You act like you're so much better than everyone else, like you don't need friends or social interaction or any of the things that normal people care about. But I think that's just an act, isn't it? I think you're just scared that if you actually tried to make friends, nobody would want you." Emma finally looked up from her textbook, meeting Madison's gaze with the steady composure that her father had taught her to maintain in confrontational situations. "I'm not bothering anyone," she said quietly, her voice carrying none of the defensiveness or anger that Madison had hoped to provoke. "I'm just trying to eat my lunch and study for my afternoon exam." "Oh, she speaks!" Brianna exclaimed with exaggerated surprise, as if Emma's response was somehow remarkable. "I was starting to think maybe you were mute or something. You never talk to anyone, you never participate in anything, you just float around like some kind of ghost." Her tone was mocking, designed to reinforce the narrative that Emma's behavior was abnormal and worthy of ridicule. Jessica Torres pulled out her phone and began recording, holding it at an angle that captured both Emma's face and the surrounding confrontation. "This is going to be so good for our social media," she announced, making no attempt to hide her intentions. "Everyone's been wondering what the weird girl is really like when you actually try to talk to her." Emma recognized the escalation that the recording represented, understanding that whatever happened next would be preserved and potentially shared with the entire school community. Her martial arts training had included discussions about situational awareness and threat assessment, and she could see that this encounter was moving beyond verbal harassment into territory that might require different responses. "Please put the phone away," Emma requested calmly, maintaining eye contact with Jessica while simultaneously tracking the positions and body language of the other three girls. "I haven't given permission to be recorded, and I don't want to be part of whatever you're planning to post online." Madison laughed, a sound that carried more malice than humor. "Oh, you don't get to make demands here. This is how things work in the real world. People like us get to decide what happens to people like you. You've been hiding behind your little invisible act for too long, and it's time for everyone to see what you're really like." Ashley leaned forward across the table, invading Emma's personal space in a way that was clearly intended to intimidate. "The thing is, we've been watching you for months now, and we've figured out your whole deal. You think you're special because you don't care about fitting in, but really you're just a coward who's afraid of being rejected. So you reject everyone else first, like that somehow makes you superior." Emma continued eating her lunch, using the familiar routine to maintain her center while assessing the developing situation. Her peripheral vision tracked the positions of other students in the courtyard, noting which ones were paying attention to the confrontation and which seemed to be deliberately avoiding involvement. She observed the body language and vocal patterns of her harassers, looking for signs of escalation that might require defensive action. "You know what I think?" Madison said, standing up and beginning to pace around Emma's table like a predator circling prey. I think you're hiding something. I think all this mysterious, antisocial behavior is covering up some really pathetic secrets that you don't want anyone to know about. Maybe your family is poor and you're ashamed of where you come from. Maybe you've got some weird medical condition that makes you think you can't be around normal people. Brianna joined Madison in circling the table, their coordinated movement, designed to create psychological pressure while maintaining the appearance of casual conversation. Or maybe, she added with a cruel smile, she's just so ugly under those baggy clothes that she doesn't want anyone to see what she really looks like. I mean, when's the last time anyone has actually seen her in anything fitted? She always wears those oversized sweaters like she's trying to hide something. Emma felt the familiar tingling sensation that indicated her body's natural stress response activating, the same physiological changes that preceded her most intensive training sessions. Her breathing remained controlled and regular, but she could sense her nervous system preparing for potential physical conflict. Years of conditioning had taught her to recognize these signs and use them to enhance rather than compromise her performance. "You're right, Bree," Ashley said, warming to the theme that her friends had introduced. "She always dresses like she's ashamed of her body. I bet she's never even been on a date, probably never even been kissed. No wonder she acts so weird around everyone. She doesn't know how to interact with people because she's never had any real relationships." The verbal attacks continued for several more minutes, with each girl taking turns contributing observations and speculation about Emma's supposed inadequacies and hidden shamas. Their comments grew progressively more personal and invasive, touching on her family background, her physical appearance, her social skills, and her presumed romantic inexperience. The coordinated nature of their assault suggested extensive preparation and planning, with each participant knowing exactly which role to play in the psychological warfare. Emma maintained her composure throughout this verbal barrage, recognizing it as a technique designed to provoke an emotional reaction that could be captured on video and used to justify whatever escalation Madison's group had planned. Her father's teachings about mental discipline and emotional control proved invaluable as she weathered insults that would have devastated most teenagers, allowing her to observe and analyze the situation with clinical detachment. The turning point came when Madison, frustrated by Emma's continued calm, decided that more dramatic action was required to achieve the kind of reaction she was seeking. "You know what?" she announced, her voice taking on a new edge of determination. "I'm tired of trying to have a conversation with someone who thinks she's too good to actually engage. Maybe it's time we found out what you're really hiding under all those baggy clothes." Emma's situational awareness immediately heightened as she recognized the shift in Madison's intentions. The verbal harassment had been building toward this moment, and she could see in Madison's posture and expression that they were about to cross a line that would transform the encounter from psychological intimidation into physical assault. Her martial arts training kicked into high alert, her body automatically shifting into a ready position while maintaining the appearance of casual attention. "I think our little ghost needs a makeover," Madison continued, moving closer to Emma's position at the table. "Something that will help her understand what it feels like to be vulnerable, to have other people making decisions about her body and her appearance." The threat implicit in these words was unmistakable, and Emma began calculating distances, angles, and potential responses to various forms of physical attack. Brianna moved to block Emma's exit route toward the main building, while Ashley positioned herself to cut off access to the parking lot. Jessica continued recording, adjusting her angle to ensure that she captured whatever was about to unfold. The coordination of their movements revealed the extent of their planning and preparation, suggesting that this confrontation had been rehearsed and choreographed to achieve maximum impact. "Stand up," Madison commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "It's time everyone got to see what you're really like when you can't hide behind your mysterious act." When Emma remained seated, continuing to eat her lunch with deliberate calm, Madison's expression darkened with anger and frustration. "I said stand up," Madison repeated, reaching across the table to grab Emma's arm and physically force her to comply. The moment Madison's hand made contact with Emma's wrist, everything changed. Emma's years of training had taught her to recognize the transition from verbal threat to physical aggression, and her body responded with reflexes that had been honed through thousands of hours of practice. The confrontation that Madison had carefully orchestrated was about to spiral beyond her control in ways that none of them could have anticipated. Emma's composed exterior masked capabilities that would shock everyone present and fundamentally alter the balance of power at Riverside High. The quiet girl who had endured months of harassment was about to reveal that there were consequences for pushing someone too far, and that appearances could be devastatingly deceptive. The moment Madison's fingers closed around Emma's wrist, attempting to force her to stand, Emma felt the familiar surge of energy that her father had taught her to recognize and channel. Years of training had conditioned her body to respond instantaneously to unwanted physical contact, but she fought against her natural reflexes, still hoping to de-escalate the situation without revealing the full extent of her capabilities. Madison's grip was firm and demanding, intended to establish physical dominance and force compliance through pain and intimidation. "Let go of my arm," Emma said quietly, her voice carrying a new undertone that made Brianna instinctively step back despite her aggressive posture. The change was subtle but unmistakable. The soft-spoken girl who had endured months of harassment without retaliation was accessing something deeper and more dangerous than any of them had imagined possible. Madison's response was to tighten her grip, digging her manicured nails into Emma's skin hard enough to leave marks. "You don't get to give me orders," she snarled, pulling harder in an attempt to force Emma to her feet. "You're going to stand up and face everyone like a normal person instead of hiding behind your weird little act." What happened next occurred so quickly that Jessica's phone camera barely captured the movement. Emma's free hand moved in a precise arc that intercepted Madison's wrist at exactly the right angle and pressure point to break her grip instantly. The technique, called kote jishi in aikido, required perfect timing and positioning to execute effectively, but Emma had practiced it thousands of times under her father's guidance. Madison found herself suddenly released and off balance, stumbling backward with a shocked expression as she stared at her reddened wrist. "How did you ... Madison began, but Emma was already rising from her seated position with the fluid grace of someone whose every movement had been refined through years of disciplined practice. Her posture had transformed completely, shifting from the defensive hunched shoulders of a harassment victim to the centered, balanced stance of a trained martial artist. The change was so dramatic that students throughout the courtyard began to take notice. Sensing that something significant was happening, Ashley moved to support Madison, but Emma's attention was now focused on all four girls simultaneously, her peripheral vision tracking their positions and movements with the hyper-awareness that came from extensive sparring experience. She could see Brianna's muscles tensing as she prepared to rush forward, could read Jessica's uncertainty as she tried to decide whether to continue recording or put her phone away, could sense Ashley's growing nervousness as she realized that their carefully planned harassment session was not proceeding as expected. "You need to leave me alone," Emma said, her voice carrying an authority that none of them had heard before. "All of you, this ends now." Her words were spoken calmly, without anger or threat, but with the absolute certainty of someone who had moved beyond the realm of verbal negotiation into a space where actions would determine outcomes. Madison, regaining her balance and her composure, decided that retreat would be interpreted as weakness by the growing audience of students who had gathered to watch the confrontation. Her social status and reputation depended on maintaining the appearance of dominance, especially in such a public setting. You think you're tough now? She demanded, moving closer to Emma despite the warning signs that a more perceptive person would have recognized. You think one lucky move makes you some kind of badass? Emma's response was to simply wait. Settling into the relaxed readiness that her father had taught her was the foundation of all effective self-defense. Her breathing remained controlled and rhythmic, her stance balanced and flexible, her hands positioned in a way that appeared casual but could transition instantly into defensive or offensive techniques. To the untrained observer, she looked calm and composed, but anyone with martial arts experience would have recognized the signs of someone prepared for serious combat. Brianna, emboldened by Madison's continued aggression and eager to prove her loyalty to the group's leader, decided to take direct action. She rushed forward with the clumsy aggression of someone whose only fighting experience came from movies and television, telegraphing her intentions with obvious body language that gave Emma plenty of time to prepare an appropriate response. Brianna's plan, such as it was, seemed to involve tackling Emma and pinning her down while the others continued their harassment. Emma's counter was a textbook demonstration of how proper training could neutralize size and strength advantages through superior technique and timing. As Brianna reached for her, Emma stepped offline with a movement called Tai Sabaki, simultaneously grabbing Brianna's extended arm and using her own momentum against her. The throw that followed was a basic judo technique called osotogari, executed with the kind of precision that comes from years of repetitive practice. Brianna found herself airborne for a brief moment before hitting the ground hard, enough to knock the wind out of her lungs. The impact was controlled. Emma had deliberately moderated the force to avoid causing serious injury, but it was impressive enough to demonstrate that she possessed skills that none of them had anticipated. Brianna lay on the grass gasping for breath, more shocked than hurt, staring up at Emma with an expression of complete bewilderment. The courtyard had gone completely silent. Students who had been eating lunch or studying at nearby tables were now standing and staring, their conversations forgotten as they processed what they had just witnessed. The quiet, invisible girl who had been the target of months of harassment had just thrown one of the school's most aggressive bullies to the ground with a move that looked like something from a martial arts demonstration. Ashley and Jessica exchanged uncertain glances, their confidence evaporating as they realized that their carefully planned attack was encountering resistance they hadn't expected or prepared for. Jessica's phone was still recording, but her hands were shaking now, and she wasn't sure whether she should continue filming or find an excuse to leave the scene before things escalated further. Madison's face flushed red with humiliation and rage as she processed the fact that her authority had been challenged successfully in front of a growing audience of students. Her entire social system depended on the understanding that she could intimidate anyone who opposed her, and Emma's calm competence was undermining that fundamental assumption. "You're going to pay for that," she hissed, her voice carrying a venom that revealed how seriously she took this challenge to her dominance. "I don't want to hurt anyone," Emma replied, maintaining her centered stance while keeping all four girls within her field of vision. "But I won't let you hurt me either. You need to walk away now, before this gets worse." Her tone remained calm and reasonable, but there was an unmistakable steel beneath the words that made it clear she was prepared for whatever escalation might follow. Madison's response was to signal Ashley with a quick gesture, a prearranged communication that indicated their backup plan was now in effect. The two girls had apparently discussed what to do if their initial approach failed, and their solution involved a coordinated attack that would overwhelm Emma through sheer numbers. Ashley nodded and began moving to flank Emma from the left while Madison approached from the right, their strategy based on the assumption that even a skilled fighter couldn't handle multiple attackers simultaneously. Emma recognized the tactical shift immediately, her training having included extensive work on dealing with multiple opponents in confined spaces. Her father had taught her that the key to handling such situations was to control positioning and timing, using movement and distance to avoid being surrounded while dealing with attackers one at a time. The confined space of the courtyard actually worked in her favor, limiting her opponent's ability to spread out and attack from multiple angles simultaneously. As Ashley rushed forward, Emma used another Tsubaki movement to step out of the line of attack while simultaneously positioning herself so that Ashley's body blocked Madison's approach. The technique required precise timing and spatial awareness, but it allowed Emma to isolate one attacker while using her as a barrier against the other. Ashley's momentum carried her past Emma's new position, and a simple foot sweep sent her sprawling across the picnic table where Emma had been eating lunch moments before. Madison, finding her attack route blocked by Ashley's fallen form, tried to grab Emma from behind, hoping to pin her arms and prevent further defensive movements. But Emma had been training for scenarios exactly like this since childhood, and her response was automatic and devastating. She dropped her center of gravity while simultaneously driving her elbow backward in a strike called Empi Uchi, catching Madison in the solar plexus with just enough force to double her over without causing permanent damage. The entire sequence had taken less than 30 seconds, but 4 aggressive students had been neutralized with techniques that demonstrated years of serious martial arts training. Emma stood in the center of the courtyard, breathing normally and apparently unaffected by the confrontation, while her attackers lay scattered around her in various states of shock and discomfort. The contrast between her calm composure and their obvious distress was striking enough to silence even the most talkative observers. Jessica, still holding her phone but no longer actively recording, found herself face to face with Emma as the only member of Madison's group still standing. "Your turn," Emma said quietly, but Jessica was already backing away, her earlier bravado completely evaporating. I wasn't. I was just recording," she stammered, as if documenting the harassment somehow absolved her of participation in it. "Delete the video," Emma instructed, her voice carrying the same calm authority that had preceded her physical demonstrations. "All of it. And you're going to help your friends understand that this harassment stops now, permanently." Jessica nodded frantically while fumbling with her phone, clearly eager to comply with any request that would get her away from this unexpectedly dangerous situation. Madison struggled to her feet, still clutching her stomach where Emma's elbow had connected. Her perfectly styled hair was disheveled, her designer clothes were wrinkled and grass-stained, and her makeup was smeared from the impact with the ground. Most importantly, her aura of invincible authority had been completely shattered in front of dozens of witnesses who would carry this story throughout the school within hours. "This isn't over," Madison gasped, though her threat lacked the conviction that had characterized her earlier pronouncements. She was clearly shaken by the ease with which Emma had handled their coordinated attack, and the growing crowd of students was already beginning to murmur among themselves about what they had witnessed. Emma's response was to take a single step forward, a movement so subtle that most observers wouldn't have noticed it, but one that caused Madison to instinctively step backward. The message was clear. Emma was no longer afraid, no longer willing to absorb harassment passively, and definitely not someone who could be intimidated by threats or social pressure. "Yes, it is," Emma said simply. "You're going to leave me alone. From now on, all of you. And if I hear about you targeting other students the way you've been targeting me, we'll have another conversation." The promise implicit in her words was unmistakable, and Madison found herself nodding reluctantly despite her anger and humiliation. Brianna and Ashley were slowly getting to their feet, both moving gingerly and avoiding eye contact with Emma or the growing crowd of observers. Their earlier confidence had been replaced by a cautious wariness that suggested they had gained a new appreciation for the consequences of physical aggression. Neither seemed eager to continue the confrontation that had already proven so costly to their group's reputation and dignity. The crowd that had gathered to watch the altercation began to disperse as teachers, alerted by the commotion, started making their way toward the courtyard. Emma quickly gathered her scattered lunch materials and textbooks, preparing to leave the scene before adult intervention could complicate the situation further. Her movements were efficient and purposeful, showing no signs of the adrenaline rush that would have affected most people after such an intense confrontation. As she walked away from the courtyard, Emma could hear the excited conversations beginning behind her as students processed what they had witnessed and prepared to share the story with friends who hadn't been present. She knew that by the end of the school day, everyone at Riverside High would have heard some version of what had happened, and that her carefully maintained anonymity was now permanently shattered. The quiet girl who had spent 3.5 years avoiding conflict had finally been forced to reveal her true capabilities, and the revelation would change everything about how she was perceived and treated at Riverside High. The social order that Madison had worked so carefully to establish and maintain had been challenged successfully, and the ripple effects of that challenge would reshape the entire school's understanding of power, respect, and the dangers of underestimating people based on appearances. News of the courtyard incident spread through Riverside High with the velocity and intensity of wildfire on a drought-stricken hillside. By the end of the school day, every student had heard some version of what had transpired, though the details varied wildly depending on who was telling the story and how many times it had been retold. The basic facts remained consistent across all versions. Madison Phillips and her crew had attempted to humiliate Emma Nakamura, and Emma had responded by demonstrating martial arts skills that left her attackers scattered across the courtyard. Like leaves in a hurricane. The immediate aftermath created a power vacuum that reverberated through every level of the school's social hierarchy. Madison, who had ruled through a combination of social manipulation and implied consequences, found herself suddenly stripped of the aura of invincibility that had made her threats effective. Students who had lived in fear of her disapproval began to question whether her authority had ever been as absolute as they had believed. The carefully constructed system of social control that had governed Riverside High for years was experiencing its first serious crack, and the implications were both thrilling and terrifying for those who had been trapped within it. Emma walked through the hallways during the final period of the day to a reception unlike anything she had experienced in her 3.5 years at Riverside High. Students who had previously looked through her as if she were invisible now stepped aside respectfully as she passed, their expressions mixing curiosity, admiration, and a healthy dose of wariness. The whispered conversations that followed in her wake were no longer about her supposed weirdness or social inadequacy, but about the incredible skills she had displayed in speculation about what other capabilities she might be hiding. Her afternoon classes proceeded with an undercurrent of excitement and tension that made concentration difficult for everyone involved. Teachers noticed the unusual energy but couldn't quite identify its source, sensing that something significant had occurred without understanding exactly what had shifted in their students' dynamics. Emma found herself the focus of covert stares and hastily whispered conversations, as classmates who had never acknowledged her existence suddenly seemed fascinated by every aspect of her behavior and appearance. The most immediate change was in how other students positioned themselves relative to Emma's presence. In a P-biology, lab partners who had previously ignored her contributions now hung on her every word, as if proximity to her might somehow transfer some of her unexpected capabilities to them. During her final study hall, students who had never spoken to her before found excuses to approach her table, offering tentative greetings and awkward attempts at conversation that revealed their uncertainty about how to interact with someone whose status had changed so dramatically. Madison's group, meanwhile, had essentially disappeared from public view following their humiliating defeat. Madison herself had spent the remainder of the school day in the nurse's office, claiming stomach problems that weren't entirely fabricated. Given the precision of Emma's elbow strike, Brianna had gone home early with her parents, complaining of back pain from her impact with the ground. Ashley and Jessica had retreated to empty classrooms and unused corridors, avoiding the main hallways where their defeated status would be visible to the entire student body. The absence of Madison's group from their usual positions of prominence created a noticeable void in the school's social ecosystem. The central cafeteria table that they had occupied for years remained empty during the final period, its vacancy serving as a visual reminder of how quickly established power structures could collapse when challenged effectively. Other students found themselves uncertain about social rules and boundaries that had previously seemed fixed and immutable, unsure whether the old hierarchy still applied or whether everything was now subject to renegotiation. Emma's locker, which had been the target of vandalism and harassment for months, suddenly became a site of pilgrimage for students seeking to catch a glimpse of the girl who had accomplished what many had secretly dreamed of but never dared attempt. The area around her locker remained respectfully clear as she gathered her materials for the day, but she could feel the weight of dozens of eyes tracking her movements with an intensity that was both gratifying and overwhelming. The transformation in how teachers and administrators responded to Emma was equally dramatic, though more subtle in its manifestation. Word of the incident had reached the faculty through unofficial channels, and while no formal disciplinary action had been taken, due to the circumstances and witness testimony, there was a new awareness of Emma that hadn't existed before. Teachers who had barely noticed her presence for years suddenly seemed to register her contributions more clearly, as if her display of unexpected capabilities had made her visible in ways that academic excellence alone had never achieved. Coach Williams, in particular, began to view Emma with new interest during PA classes. Having heard detailed accounts of her martial arts techniques from students who had witnessed the courtyard confrontation, he started paying closer attention to her movement patterns and physical capabilities during routine exercises. Emma found herself under increased scrutiny as the coach tried to reconcile the awkward, seemingly uncoordinated student he thought he knew with the skilled fighter that others had described. The ripple effects extended beyond individual relationships to affect the broader culture of bullying and intimidation that had characterized Riverside High for years. Students who had been targets of harassment from various groups found themselves experiencing unexpected reprieve as their tormentors began to question whether their victims might possess hidden capabilities similar to Emma's. The unspoken understanding that certain students could be victimized with impunity was replaced by a more cautious approach that recognized the potential consequences of underestimating people based on appearances. Emma's small circle of friends experienced their own transformation as their association with her suddenly carried social benefits rather than risks. James, her former chemistry lab partner who had been pressured to distance himself from her, approached her after school with an apologetic expression and a request to resume their academic collaboration. Sarah Martinez, a quiet girl from her English class who had always admired Emma's intelligence but had been afraid to befriend her, finally worked up the courage to invite her to join a study group for their upcoming literature exam. The most significant change, however, was in Emma's own relationship with her environment and her sense of agency within it. For the first time since arriving at Riverside High, she walked through the hallways with her head held high, no longer needing to calculate routes that would minimize contact with potential tormentors. The constant vigilance that had characterized her daily routine was replaced by a more relaxed awareness, though she remained alert to her surroundings out of habit and training. Her father noticed the change immediately when she arrived at the dojo for their evening training session. The tension and stress that had been building in her shoulders and facial expressions for months had visibly diminished, replaced by the centered confidence that he had worked so hard to cultivate through years of martial arts instruction. When Emma described the day's events, he listened with the careful attention of a teacher evaluating his student's application of learned principles in real-world situations. "You showed restraint," he observed after hearing her account of the confrontation. "You used only the minimum force necessary to neutralize the threat and protect yourself. This demonstrates that you understand the difference between self-defense and aggression, between protecting yourself and seeking to harm others." His approval was evident not just in his words, but in his posture and expression, the pride of an instructor whose student had applied their training wisely under pressure. Conversation that followed explored the broader implications of Emma's actions and the responsibilities that came with having revealed her capabilities to her school community. Her father emphasized that her display of martial arts skills would inevitably change how others perceived and interacted with her, creating new opportunities but also new challenges and expectations. The invisibility that had protected her for years was now permanently gone, replaced by a visibility that would require different strategies for navigating social relationships. At home that evening, Emma's mother noticed the change in her daughter's demeanor during their family dinner. The quiet stress that had shadowed Emma's expressions for months had lifted, replaced by a sense of resolution and empowerment that transformed her entire presence. When Emma shared the story of her confrontation with Madison's group, her mother's reaction combined concern for her daughter's safety with pride in her ability to protect herself when necessary. The family discussion that followed touched on themes of responsibility, consequence, and the importance of using power judiciously. Emma's parents had always taught her that martial arts training was about more than physical techniques, encompassing mental discipline, ethical behavior, and the wisdom to know when action was appropriate and when restraint was the better choice. They reinforced their belief that she had handled the situation correctly, defending herself without seeking revenge or causing unnecessary harm to her attackers. Meanwhile, across town, Madison Phillips was experiencing the most difficult evening of her high school career. The humiliation of her public defeat was compounded by the realization that her entire approach to social dominance had been built on assumptions that were fundamentally flawed. The quiet girl she had dismissed as weak and vulnerable had proven to be neither, and the ease with which Emma had neutralized their attack suggested levels of training and capability that Madison had never imagined possible. The phone calls and text messages from other students began almost immediately after school ended, with friends and acquaintances seeking details about what had happened and expressing varying degrees of shock, amusement, and concern. Madison found herself in the unfamiliar position of having to explain a defeat rather than celebrate a victory, struggling to find ways to describe the encounter that didn't further damage her already compromised reputation. Her parents' reaction when they learned about the incident was a mixture of anger, embarrassment, and concern for both their daughter's physical well-being and her social standing within the community. The Phillips family's prominence in local business and social circles meant that any public humiliation involving their daughter would inevitably reflect on their own reputation and influence. The conversation that followed was tense and uncomfortable, focusing on damage control and strategies for rebuilding. Madison's compromised position. Brianna Walsh's experience was similarly traumatic, as the girl who had prided herself on physical intimidation and aggressive confrontation found herself questioning everything she had believed about strength and dominance. The ease with which Emma had thrown her to the ground had been both painful and humiliating, demonstrating that her size and aggressive attitude were meaningless against someone with proper training and technique. Ashley Chen and Jessica Torres faced their own reckonings with the consequences of their participation in systematic harassment. Both girls came from families that valued academic achievement and social responsibility, and their involvement in bullying behavior was difficult to reconcile with the values they had been taught at home. The video evidence that Jessica had deleted contained clear documentation of their group's aggressive behavior, making it impossible for them to claim innocence or minimize their roles in the confrontation. The broader student body's reaction to the day's events varied widely depending on individual experiences and perspectives. Students who had been targets of Madison's group or similar bullying networks felt a sense of validation and hope, seeing Emma's successful resistance as proof that the established social order could be challenged. Those who had benefited from or participated in the existing hierarchy experienced uncertainty and anxiety about what the new social dynamics might mean for their own positions. Relationships. Teachers and administrators began receiving reports and complaints from various sources, creating a complex web of competing narratives about what had actually occurred in the courtyard. The lack of serious injuries and the abundance of witness testimony supporting Emma's right to defend herself complicated any potential disciplinary response, while the clear evidence of harassment and intimidation by Madison's group made it difficult to portray Emma as an aggressor. The evening news cycle at Riverside High, conducted through social media platforms and text message chains, carried the story to every corner of the school community and beyond. Parents began hearing accounts of the incident from their children, leading to conversations about bullying, self-defense, and the complex social dynamics that govern teenage interactions. The story of the quiet girl who had revealed hidden martial arts skills captured imaginations and sparked discussions that extended far beyond the boundaries of the school itself. As Emma completed her evening training routine and prepared for sleep, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in the space of a single afternoon. The girl who had spent years trying to remain invisible had become the most talked about student at Riverside High, her actions reshaping social relationships and power structures that had seemed permanent and unchangeable. The transformation was both liberating and daunting, offering new possibilities while demanding greater responsibility and awareness of her impact on others. The following morning at Riverside High brought a transformed social landscape that few could have imagined just 24 hours earlier. Emma arrived at school to find herself at the center of a completely reorganized ecosystem of relationships, respect, and responsibility that extended far beyond her personal circle of influence. The parking lot conversations that had once focused on weekend parties and social media drama now buzzed with discussions about martial arts, self-defense, and the unexpected revelation that the quiet girl everyone had overlooked possessed capabilities that demanded serious recognition. Students who had never acknowledged Emma's existence now approached her with a mixture of curiosity, respect, and carefully modulated friendliness that reflected their uncertainty about how to interact with someone whose status had shifted so dramatically overnight. Lisa Wong, a sophomore who had been targeted by Madison's group earlier in the year, worked up the courage to approach Emma at her locker with tears in her eyes and a trembling voice, expressing gratitude for proving that their tormentors weren't invincible after all. The hallways themselves seemed different, with subtle but significant changes in traffic patterns as students unconsciously adjusted their routes to bring them closer to Emma's presence rather than avoiding it. The invisible barriers that had previously segregated different social groups became more permeable as Emma's example demonstrated that strength and capability could exist in unexpected forms and places. Students who had been relegated to the margins of social acceptance found themselves emboldened to occupy spaces and participate in conversations that had previously been denied to them. Emma's morning classes proceeded with an undercurrent of anticipation and energy that transformed even routine academic activities into opportunities for observation and evaluation. Her contributions to class discussions were met with heightened attention from both teachers and students, as if her demonstrated martial arts skills had somehow enhanced the value and authority of her intellectual insights. Teachers who had taken her quiet competence for granted now recognized her as a student worthy of special consideration and respect. During first period AP Literature, Mrs. Rodriguez noticed that other students were paying closer attention to Emma's analysis of character development in their current novel, treating her observations about conflict resolution and personal transformation with new gravity. The irony wasn't lost on Emma that her classmates were suddenly fascinated by her insights into fictional characters' struggles with identity and empowerment, themes that she had been living and navigating in her own life for years. The transformation was perhaps most evident in PE class, where Coach Williams approached Emma with a combination of professional curiosity and newfound respect that marked a complete reversal from his previous dismissive attitude. He asked if she would be willing to demonstrate some basic self-defense techniques for the class, acknowledging that her skills might be valuable for other students to learn. Emma agreed, understanding that sharing knowledge was part of the responsibility that came with her revealed capabilities. The demonstration that followed was carefully controlled and educational, focusing on basic principles of situational awareness, personal space, and simple defensive movements rather than the more advanced techniques that had been necessary during her confrontation with Madison's group. Emma emphasized the mental and philosophical aspects of martial arts training, explaining how discipline, respect, and restraint were just as important as physical techniques in creating effective self-defense capabilities. Her classmates watched with rapt attention as she explained how proper breathing, balanced stance, and calm assessment of threats could prevent many dangerous situations from escalating to physical confrontation. The demonstration served multiple purposes. It provided valuable information for students who might face harassment or assault. It reinforced Emma's commitment to using her skills responsibly, and it established her as a resource and protector, rather than a threat to be feared. The lunch period brought the most dramatic evidence of how completely the school's social dynamics had shifted overnight. The central cafeteria table that had served as Madison's throne for years remained conspicuously empty, its vacancy a powerful symbol of how quickly established hierarchies could collapse when their foundations proved to be built on intimidation rather than genuine respect or capability. Other students navigated the seating arrangements with visible uncertainty, unsure whether the old rules still applied or whether new patterns of association were emerging. Emma found herself surrounded by an eclectic mix of students who had never spoken to each other before. Her example had demonstrated that social boundaries were more fluid than they had believed. Academic achievers sat next to former outcasts, athletes engaged in conversation with theater students, and international students who had been marginalized by language barriers found themselves welcomed into discussions about courage, identity, and the importance of standing up for oneself and others. The conversation at Emma's table ranged from practical questions about martial arts training to deeper philosophical discussions about the nature of strength, the responsibility that came with capability, and the ways that preconceptions and stereotypes prevented people from recognizing the full humanity and potential of those around them. Emma found herself serving as both teacher and student in these exchanges, sharing insights from her training while learning about the experiences and perspectives of classmates she had never had the opportunity to know before. Madison Phillips, meanwhile, was experiencing the most difficult period of her high school career as she struggled to process the complete destruction of the power structure she had spent years building and maintaining. Her absence from school on Wednesday had been attributed to illness, but everyone understood that she was avoiding the social scrutiny and potential humiliation that would inevitably accompany her return to an environment where her authority had been so publicly challenged and defeated. When Madison finally returned to school on Thursday, the change in her reception was immediately apparent to anyone who bothered to observe. Students who had once competed for her attention now offered polite but distant greetings that lacked the desperate eagerness that had characterized their previous interactions. The hallway conversations that had once stopped when she approached now continued without interruption, as if her presence was no longer significant enough to warrant special consideration. Her core group of followers had also undergone significant changes in their behavior and social positioning. Brianna Walsh, Still dealing with the physical and psychological aftermath of being thrown to the ground by someone half her size, had become noticeably quieter and less aggressive in her interactions with other students. The girl who had built her identity around physical intimidation was forced to reconsider her entire approach to social relationships when confronted with evidence that her intimidation tactics were useless against someone with proper training. Ashley Chen found herself questioning not just her association with Madison's group, but the entire value system that had led her to participate in systematic harassment of vulnerable students. Her academic excellence and family background had always provided her with alternative sources of self-worth, but her involvement in bullying behavior was difficult to reconcile with the principles of respect and ethical behavior that her parents had worked to instill. The cognitive dissonance created by this conflict was forcing her to examine her choices and consider whether her pursuit of social status had compromised her integrity in ways that she was only now beginning to understand. Jessica Torres faced similar internal conflicts as she processed the implications of her role in documenting and perpetuating harassment that could have escalated to serious assault if Emma hadn't possessed the skills necessary to defend herself. The video evidence that she had deleted contained clear documentation of her group's aggressive behavior, and the knowledge that she had been complicit in activities that could have resulted in serious harm to another student was causing her to reevaluate her priorities and associations. The broader impact of Emma's actions extended beyond the immediate participants to influence students throughout Riverside High who had witnessed or heard about the confrontation. The demonstration that bullying behavior could have serious consequences, and that victims might possess unexpected resources for defending themselves, created a ripple effect that touched every corner of the school's social ecosystem. Students who had been targets of harassment from various groups found themselves experiencing unexpected relief as their tormentors became more cautious about their behavior, uncertain whether their victims might possess capabilities similar to Emma's. The unspoken understanding that certain students could be victimized with impunity was replaced by a more respectful approach that recognized the potential dignity and strength of every individual. Teachers and administrators began to notice subtle but significant changes in classroom dynamics and hallway interactions that suggested a fundamental shift in how students were relating to each other. Reports of bullying incidents decreased dramatically in the weeks following the courtyard confrontation, not because the reporting systems had changed, but because the actual incidents were becoming less frequent as students reconsidered the wisdom and safety of aggressive behavior toward their peers. Emma's father observed these changes during his evening conversations with his daughter, noting how her daily experiences at school had shifted from defensive navigation of hostile territory to more positive engagement with classmates who now approached her with respect and genuine interest. The stress and tension that had characterized her demeanor for months had been replaced by a sense of empowerment and responsibility that reflected the successful application of martial arts principles in real-world situations. Their training sessions at the dojo took on new dimensions as they explored the philosophical and ethical implications of Emma's public demonstration of her capabilities. Her father emphasized the importance of using her enhanced status and influence to protect and support others rather than to seek personal advantage or revenge against those who had mistreated her. The principles of martial arts extended beyond physical techniques to encompass leadership, mentorship, and the responsibility to use strength in service of justice rather than personal gain. Emma's mother noticed similar changes in her daughter's confidence and sense of agency, observing how she now moved through the world with the assured bearing of someone who knew she could handle whatever challenges might arise. The anxiety and hypervigilance that had characterized Emma's behavior during the months of harassment had been replaced by a calmer, more centered presence that reflected her successful integration of martial arts training with daily life challenges. Transformation extended beyond Emma's immediate family, to impact the broader community as word of the incident spread through local networks of parents, teachers, and community leaders. The story of the quiet girl who had revealed martial arts skills to defend herself against bullies captured imaginations and sparked conversations about education, discipline, cultural diversity, and the importance of recognizing and nurturing the full potential of every student. Local martial arts schools reported increased interest from parents seeking self-defense training for their children, while community organizations began discussing programs that would combine physical training with character development and conflict resolution skills. Emma's example had demonstrated the value of martial arts education that emphasized mental discipline and ethical behavior alongside physical techniques, inspiring others to explore similar approaches to personal development and community safety. As the semester progressed toward its conclusion, the changes that had begun with Emma's moment of revealed strength continued to evolve and expand throughout Riverside High. The incident in the courtyard had served as a catalyst for broader transformations in how students understood concepts of strength, respect, and community responsibility. The quiet girl who had wanted nothing more than to complete her education without incident had become an inadvertent agent of positive change, whose influence would be felt long after her graduation. Emma herself continued to navigate her enhanced visibility and influence with the same thoughtful consideration that had characterized her approach to martial arts training. She used her new status to support other students who faced harassment or discrimination, while maintaining the humility and restraint that her father had taught her were essential qualities for anyone entrusted with significant capabilities. The girl who had once hidden her strength had learned to wield it wisely, understanding that true power lay not in the ability to harm others, but in the wisdom to protect and empower those who needed support and encouragement. The legacy of that Tuesday afternoon confrontation would continue to influence Riverside High long after Emma's graduation, serving as a reminder that appearances could be deceiving, that strength could take many forms, and that the quiet ones often possessed depths that deserved recognition and respect. The social order that had seemed so permanent and unchangeable had been transformed by the simple act of one person refusing to accept mistreatment and demonstrating the courage to stand up for herself when circumstances demanded action. 3 years after graduation, Emma received an unexpected message on social media. It was from Madison Phillips, now a college sophomore studying psychology with a focus on bullying prevention. The message was long, heartfelt, and filled with genuine remorse for her past behavior. "I know this might sound crazy," Madison wrote, "but that day in the courtyard changed my entire life. Not just because you defended yourself, but because you showed me what real strength looked like. You could have seriously hurt us, but you didn't. Used exactly enough force to stop us and no more. That restraint taught me more about power and responsibility than anything else ever had." Madison had become an advocate for anti-bullying programs at her university, using her own story as an example of how toxic behavior could be transformed through confronting consequences and choosing growth over revenge. She credited Emma's example with showing her that true leadership meant protecting others, not dominating them. Emma smiled as she read the message, remembering her father's words about how martial arts was ultimately about transformation, not just of oneself, but of the situations and people around you. She had never sought to humiliate Madison or destroy her life. She had simply refused to be a victim. Now working as a youth counselor while pursuing her master's degree, Emma often shared her story with young people facing their own struggles with bullying and self-doubt. The quiet girl who had once hidden her strength had learned that sometimes the greatest victory came not from fighting, but from showing others what was possible when someone refused to accept defeat. What did you think of Emma's incredible journey from victim to victor? Have you ever had to stand up for yourself in an unexpected way? Share your own stories of courage in the comments below. Your experience might inspire someone else who needs to hear it today. If this story of hidden strength and unexpected justice resonated with you, make sure to subscribe for more incredible tales of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest stories of triumph, transformation, and the power of standing up for what's right.